I first started following running as a fan when I was running in university. By then, I had done 2 or 3 marathons, and when I joined the Concordia cross country team, it was the first time I trained with a team since my high school track years. I ended up taking 35 minutes off my personal best for the marathon after about 6 months of 5K training. A few years later, I followed the US marathon women heading to the 2012 Olympics, and I was blown away by how fast they ran for the distance. With time, I became aware of the East African dominance over the marathon distance, and before I finished university, one of my teammates at the time had decided to go spend 1 month living and training in Kenya. I thought this was amazing. At the time, I remember thinking that if I had a dream vacation or trip, that's what it would be, second only to being able to run for a living. Our guest today got to live out this dream for 15 months in Ethiopia, and he tells us all about the experience and what he learned from the greatest runners in the world in his new book. So hi, and welcome to the Running Book Reviews podcast, where we review running books to help keep you motivated about your running or maybe inspire you to try something new. We also hope that listening to us chat about running will encourage you to read the book for yourself. My name is Liz, and with my co-host Alan, we're going to talk with author Michael Crawley about his new book, Out of Thin Air.
Out of Thin Air is the story of the author's time living and training with some of the best runners in the world in Ethiopia. The book's divided into 14 chapters, and each chapter describes kind of a facet of training life in Ethiopia and some of the reasons and the beliefs associated with it. There are lots of little stories about Michael's experience, like when he was woken up at 3 a.m. for the first time to join the others for a night run. Because he spent more than a year, I think it was 15 months altogether, training with the group, he got a real chance to develop friendships and integrate into the running scene, but always ended up struggling to compete on the training runs, many of which were done at altitude with some blazing fast runners. So let me tell you a little bit about Michael Crawley. He's a 2:20 marathon runner who has competed internationally for Scotland and Great Britain. He's currently assistant professor in social anthropology at Durham University in the UK. Out of Thin Air is his first book. The writing was supported by a postdoctoral fellowship from the Economic and Social Research Council. And I think an illustration of the sort of love and affection that Michael has developed for Ethiopian running would be that it's revealed in his book that his daughter Madeline, her middle name is Tirunesh, which I assume is after Ethiopia's gold medal prodigy, Tirunesh Dibaba. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, Tirunesh means good girl in Amharic.
Ah, okay.
Or she is good.
Okay, so it's not necessarily after Tirunesh Dibaba.
Well, yeah, it is. Yeah, I suppose it's a bit
Basically,
both.
it is. But that's good to know what it means. Obvious first question is, what prompted you to want to go to Ethiopia in particular, and why did you decide to write the book?
Well, I think I've always been interested in running culture sort of more broadly. So that began growing up in the Northeast and being interested in Gateshead Harriers, which I think is where you're from. Kind of trying to explain why there were so many top athletes from a very small part of the UK at that time, what kind of culture of running there was around there that made them so good. And then I decided to focus on Ethiopia in the East African context, just because it's far less is known about Ethiopia basically than other countries, especially Kenya, because of the kind of colonial context with Kenya, the fact that a lot of the runners can speak relatively good English. That tends to be where people go when they want to talk about East African running. And I felt like people would often sort of describe running from the region as East African running, even though there's this whole host of different kind of cultures within East Africa and even within Ethiopia. You know, Ethiopia's actually got over 80 different languages. It's got a lot of different ethnic groups, lots of different kind of cultures, even within that one country. So it just seemed like a particularly interesting place to go.
Did you have to acquire language skills?
Yeah, so I kind of speak some Amharic, which is the sort of the main language, I suppose, that's used officially. I speak a sort of running specific version of Amharic, where I'm very good at discussing training times and training runs and that kind of thing, and not so good at talking about other stuff really. But my running Amharic's good enough to get by.
And how did you choose like the particular group that you ended up joining, or was that sort of like you ended up just turning up in Addis Ababa and then just kind of figuring it out from there? Was it planned?
So to begin with, I did what a lot of anthropologists do in this sort of situation, which is to put themselves in a position of kind of the apprentice, to go to people and ask them and sort of try to learn their craft from them. And that can be a particularly good way of trying to understand the logic of an activity, I suppose. So I started by just sort of wandering up into the forest above where I lived. And the beauty of that particular bit of forest is that you couldn't, if you walk up there at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's always somebody out for a run, or some groups of people out for a run, and people would just sort of grab me, and I'd be sort of swept up in the running more or less straight away. And I did that because I kind of wanted to get a sense of what running looked like at all different levels of the sport. So to begin with, those runners who I was running with at the start of fieldwork were usually runners who weren't necessarily attached to a club yet in Ethiopia. They were kind of hopeful, sort of the up and coming athletes, I suppose. So that allowed me to get a sense of what their lives were like. But then I also wanted to look at people who were able to run abroad and compete internationally, and who were traveling to races in China and places like that. So I went and did like a lot of training with some athletes from a sports management agency called Moyo Sports. And luckily, I already knew the manager of that team, Malcolm Anderson, because he's based in Edinburgh, where I was living. So I already knew him pretty well, and he was able to introduce me to them and to, ask the coach to let me go along to training with them. And it was through that kind of relationship really that I was able to get such good access to the runners and to be able to be embedded in that team for such a long time.
Just a pause, probably for our listeners, I should ask you the question, what's an anthropologist and what does an anthropologist do?
Yeah, so social anthropologists are basically interested in culture and sociality, so how people relate to each other. And the main research method that anthropologists use is ethnography, which means literally writing culture. So we're interested in basically, trying to do long-term field work, which involves basically developing a committed relationship to a place and to a group of people, and then being able to write about it sort of as far as possible from the point of view of that group of people. So that's kind of what I was trying to do in Ethiopia. And what it meant was using a method that's normally called participant observation, where you just spend a lot of time observing what's happening, but which is also called observant participation. So to kind of emphasize the fact that with the study of something like running, you are really participating in the activity, and that's kind of the main research method. So it was very important for me as an anthropologist to make sure that I was doing as much of the training as I could with people, and trying to live the rest of the lifestyle as well, eating the similar foods, resting when they rested, being around the compound with them, sort of being involved in the kind of whole life of a runner in Ethiopia, I suppose.
So I was just wondering, like, did you find it hard to both be a researcher and a participant? Because I remember when my previous coach, he used to run the workouts with us when we were kind of relatively small, and his rationale was because he wanted to see how it felt to run those workouts and to have to recover from them. So it gave him perspective when he was planning workouts, like, is it too hard or is it reasonable, or that kind of thing. And then eventually he said, like, it was too hard to do both. It was too hard to be a coach and be an athlete at the same time. So I was wondering, like, did you find the same? Was it difficult to be the researcher and part of the group?
It was, and that's for a number of reasons. Like, firstly, it was very difficult for me to keep up with the athletes, with the majority of the athletes that I was training with, because the group at that time kind of ranged from sort of 2:07 marathon runners up to about 2:14, maybe something like that. So I was considerably slower and also less acclimatized to the altitude. So in order to really be a part of the group, I was sort of overtraining quite a lot of the time, trying to keep up. And then luckily the way that the training sessions were run was normally there would be the team bus going along with us. So I could do the first half of a run or the first 2/3 of a run and then just jump in the bus and it was okay. But it's hard to both participate well and observe well. But it seemed to me that it was very important for my relationship with the runners that I was seen to be turning up to all the sessions and at least kind of trying hard and suffering alongside them, and they kind of respected that. But it helped. There was one period where I was injured, so I couldn't run, so I was on the bus for sort of 3 weeks observing from the bus, which was actually really useful to have that period of time where I was a little bit more detached, and I was able to spend a lot of time talking to the coach about his role and that kind of side of things as well. So I kind of did a bit of both, I guess.
So this book, Out of Thin Air, it's actually a postdoctoral research publication.
Yeah, I guess so. It's so I basically wrote my PhD thesis first when I got back from Ethiopia, and then I wrote the book afterwards. So the book is kind of a sort of rewriting of the PhD, but without the kind of more theoretical anthropology.
You realize no one's going to buy it now. Of course, I've just said that. Everybody's going to go, oh God, I'm not going to buy that. Guys, the book is fantastically readable, and we'll give you our views on it at the end. But it's a brilliant little set of stories and insights into culture there. From a joining with the Ethiopians on their runs point of view, you said you sort of rocked up at 6 a.m. on the hills in the forest, and people just sort of say, "Hey, you get on the group, get on the line, and off you go." Is it really that easy? Is there something in the water there or in their culture that they go, oh, there's somebody on their own, let's get them in?
Yeah, I mean, it's running is seen as a social activity really in Ethiopia, especially running that is for the purpose of improving yourself and becoming a better runner. Is seen as something that has to be done with other people. So people would say running alone is just for health. It's just, what people do to stay healthy and, keep their weight down and things like that. But if you want to be changed, as people put it, if you want to transform yourself and become an elite athlete, you have to run with other people all the time. So it was seen as, on the days when I did just feel like going out for a run on my own, that was seen as really quite deeply antisocial behavior in Ethiopia. It's very different sort of culture to here. And that's true of other things in Ethiopia as well. Eating alone is really kind of frowned upon as well. So it's a broader part of the culture to sort of value communal activity. But with running especially, it's seen as something that you need to do with others if you want to get better.
So if you would say the running here is almost viewed as a solo type sport or activity, would you say that running in Ethiopia is viewed as very much a group activity?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So a lot of the younger runners, before they sort of come to Addis Ababa, they're living in training camps that are funded by sort of regional water companies or something like that. Lots of government-backed companies, agencies have running clubs attached to them where they pay people a small salary to be athletes, basically. And I went to stay in a couple of these training camps, and basically everyone lives in more or less kind of barracks-style accommodation where they're sharing rooms with maybe 6 people in a room, and then they're doing all of their training sessions together. So it becomes part of the way that the sport is run, basically. And then when people move to Addis Ababa and they start to think about going abroad to run, that kind of communal approach to training just is still very important to people.
So maybe it would be a good time, because you kind of like, there are certain things you sort of demystified. One of them is because, here we all kind of have this romanticized version of the Kenyans and the Ethiopians just, coming from a very poor background and running to school barefoot, and then they end up being great runners. And for sure, I guess there are stories like that, but that's not the bulk of the runners. So I guess maybe you can explain a little bit about the trajectory that they have, like to get to these sort of running teams.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think most Ethiopian young people who grow up in rural parts of Ethiopia the runners would talk about being strong as a result of their upbringing, because they've been working on the farm, whether that's kind of herding animals during the day or helping with plowing and things like that. So they do talk about that rural upbringing being important for making them strong as athletes. But I think to just focus on those kind of deterministic factors, like the fact that people are poor, or the fact that people or to look for kind of genetic explanations for East African running success, kind of downplays the hard work that goes into it, and the kind of and also the institutional support that Ethiopian runners especially have. So like as I said, there's a lot of training centers that are set up by the government or funded by banks or the prison service and things like that. And so there are a huge number of runners who are just paid a salary just to focus on their running. And so they are effectively full-time athletes, and that would be, hundreds, if not thousands of people in Ethiopia. And that's something that I think most people just don't realize that that's the case. And if we compare that with the UK, where we have like lottery funding for runners, I wouldn't think there's more than, 10 or 15 distance runners who are paid a decent amount of money to just run in the UK. So that is a huge difference, and that's nothing to do with running to school barefoot. That's all to do with this kind of institutional support, I think.
I guess in America, the teams have support from shoe companies, so they have shoe deals, or they have a team which is sponsored by a sports company.
Yeah,
and that's the way that they group there.
Yeah, and a lot of the top British runners end up in the States for that reason, I guess, to join one of those groups. So kind of similar reasoning, yeah.
In the training with the Ethiopians, you they refer to something about their condition or being in their condition, which when I was reading the book, I thought, yeah, okay, well, it's their level of fitness. But then as you read through it, it's kind of more than that. Can you describe to us a bit about the Ethiopians' view of being in condition?
Yeah, sure. So people use the word condition in English, even when they were speaking in Amharic, they would just throw the word condition in. And as you say, that if you just sort of the direct translation to English, you just assume that means, condition of fitness or fitness level or something like that. Whereas in actual fact, I felt like it's kind of connected to the way that people talked about air conditions. So like the different altitudes around the city. And it was just, it kind of described a far more holistic idea than what we would think about if we were just thinking about purely the kind of the physical condition or level of fitness within an individual person. So it describes kind of people's access to different environments around the city that they were able to train in, all kinds of things about what people were able to eat and how much rest they were able to get and things like that. So it was just a term that seemed to have this kind of broader resonance than just the simple English translation, I suppose.
So you actually get to run a cross country race while you're in Ethiopia, which is really exciting, and it just goes to show the depth of talent that's over there. How was that? Because you ended up running, so it's a little bit different. So I found it interesting that you were told that you had to drop out before the end. You got lapped, which is something like that never happens in like North America or anywhere else, I don't think. So maybe you can tell us about that experience, because that must have been interesting, not knowing if you'd be able to finish the race or not.
Yeah, it's actually, it does happen in some cross-country races. So like in the Scottish national cross-country, the top runners usually lap the back markers in the last lap of the race in Scotland. But in Ethiopia, it was a race that you had to qualify for to run in that national championship. So everyone was really fast, and there was just no way that I should have been there. And that was the deal. Yeah, if I got lapped, I had to stop. But it was just in terms of like understanding the fact that athletics is just so relative. I'd finished 7th in the Scottish national cross country the year before, and I went to Ethiopia and I was just like dead last immediately in the field.
How many people? Were in the?
Not huge amounts actually, because maybe 150 in that race, something like that. So it was a relatively small field. But what was interesting about it is that most of the people in that race were kind of running to win, or they were running to finish very, very high up, which meant that people just, if they realize that they're not going to achieve what they want to achieve on that day, then they'll often just drop out of a race. There's not really the kind of stigma attached to dropping out. So what happened was, as I was running along, eventually catching up with back markers in the race, they would just stop as soon as they're overtaken by the white guy. That was it. They would just drop out. So every time I overtook someone, I ended up being back in last place.
It was kind of a sense of failure for them to be overtaken by this token white guy who's
totally yeah.
No hope. So, he's only 7th in the national championships.
But this is I actually found Malcolm, the manager for Moyo Sports that I was telling you about. He found some photos from 2015 today. So I just posted one on Instagram of me at the back of the cross country.
Oh, cool.
So if people want to visualize what that looked like, I won't give away whether, because the deal was that I had to not be lapped if I wanted to finish the race, but I won't give away whether I managed to or not. We can let people read the book to find that out.
You have to read the book to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting though that there's a philosophy in sort of Western running that don't get into a habit of dropping out, because it plays with your mind, and it's mentally soft if you go into the run and you figure, well, I'll drop out if it's not my day. It seems to be a slightly different approach with the Ethiopian culture.
Yeah, I'm not sure about how probably psychologically it's not that good a habit to learn to drop out all the time, but the logic was just that, if you're not going to, because that race was a trial race for the world cross country, I think, or for the African cross country. So it was the top 6 or the top 8 would be selected. So if you were definitely not going to be in that top 6 or top 8, then the idea was that you're better off saving your energy for the next race or the next training session or whatever. So that was kind of the logic behind it.
It seems that the training groups, are not logging miles and clocking kilometers on their watch like Liz does all the time. Liz stops her watch every time she pauses. If we stop on the street corner, she goes, "Oh, stop my watch."
I do that as well, to be fair.
Yeah, because you can.
We end up running the same race and with the same training session, and I end up with half a k more than her because if I'm walking or standing up, my watch is running. But the Ethiopians, they don't have so many GPS watches, I guess, but they don't seem to value them as much or even use them.
Yeah, they definitely didn't use them in exactly the same way. So I feel like there were certain training sessions where people really wanted to know how fast they were running, and they were like the Friday morning session where we would go to an asphalt road, and those roads were kind of marked out. The kilometers were marked out anyway on the road with the white post, and people would know roughly what certain top athletes were able to run for 20k on that road, for example. So they would want to know very objectively what they could do, and so then they would wear the GPS watch for that kind of training session. But then there's also a lot of running in the forests and things, and that running was supposed to be slower and supposed to be kind of more regenerative and supposed to be a different kind of running, which was more about kind of exploring the forest and having a good time and feeling a bit adventurous. And that kind of running, it was often seen as inappropriate to wear a GPS because people didn't mind and what pace they were running. And sometimes they would even put the GPS on just for fun, just to see how slow they could go in the forest. So people would run, 10-minute kilometers sometimes. Even, guys who could run 2:06 for a marathon would just run incredibly slowly. I mean, when I was first there in 2015, there were hardly any GPS watches at all. So maybe 1 or 2 people had them. And then they obviously became more kind of sought after, and they would come into the country through managers or whatever. So they became more widely used, but it was less a case of everyone had one and they were meticulously logging everything on it than just it was a tool to use in training. So for a while, when only a couple of people had one, people would borrow it to go and do a run to see what sort of shape they were in. They were sort of used communally in a way that we wouldn't in the UK. So for example, one funny thing was that when the Breaking 2 project was on with Nike, they gave a GPS watch to Kenenisa Bekele, and they were looking at the kilometers that he'd ran with it, and it was, some crazy 250 kilometers a week or even more sometimes. And Haile, my friend in Ethiopia, said to me, yeah, but he wasn't the one who was wearing it the whole time. He'd have been lending it to people. It wouldn't have always been him. So yeah, they kind of move around between people more than they would in the UK, I think.
So then do they track their workouts at all? Like, do they just do like time based or something like that? Or like, how do they or does the coach just say, go run and come back and at this time, or how does that work?
So it depended on the session really, but the sort of general week would be Monday, we would go to do a long run on kind of a rough road kind of surface. So like a gravelly road. And normally he'd be quite strict about what sort of pace he wanted people to run, and that was mainly for kind of to make sure people weren't running too fast, basically. So he would say start off at 4 minutes per kilometer and get down to sort of 3:30, 3:20, something like that, but don't go crazy. And then on Wednesdays we would do speed training, but that would all usually be like sort of 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute reps, stuff like that. But run as fast and as hard as you want. But it wasn't objectively measured. Usually it was like around a big field on the watch. And then, as I said, on Friday mornings it would be on the road, and we'd do like a progression run or a tempo run or something like that. And that would be, he'd set the times very strictly on that. But then, yeah, the rest of the week would just be running. He'd say, go tomorrow morning, run for an hour and 20 minutes, easy. And that would be all he'd say. He wouldn't stipulate a pace for easy runs. And there was a real big difference between the hard sessions and the easy sessions. And the easy sessions were generally really quite easy. Even, I could keep up pretty easily on the easier runs, not on the hard sessions.
So another thing you mentioned about the GPS watch was that some of the runners would look at how many calories they lost, but not, we kind of look at it where we're sort of like, oh, well, it means I can eat this much pizza. They were actually it would make them stressed because they were worried about replacing those calories.
Mm-hmm.
So did those GPS watches end up just giving them just as much stress as it gives us, but in a different way, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think like the main concern that a lot of the runners had that I knew was with their energy levels and maintaining energy levels in a reasonable place, and not, as they put it, burning themselves up by doing too much training and basically just burning out. So people were genuinely worried about that, because if you're running and trying to make a breakthrough as a marathon runner in Ethiopia, that's quite a real risk, I think, to do too much, because you're desperately trying to get to the next level in order to try to make some money, provide for your family or whatever. So they were concerned about energy levels, and the watch quantified that in a way that was different to what they were used to, I suppose. So you would get people looking at the kind of calories on the watch, and then going to supermarkets to try to look at the calories on food packets and things in a way that they just wouldn't have done before, because they'd have bought food in the market and things like that. So but yeah, kind of the opposite way of using the GPS to the way that we might, in terms of the anxiety around calories. And also sometimes they would use the watch, as I said, to go as slowly as possible rather than to go as fast as possible. Quite a different attitude sometimes towards kind of speed and slowness and burning calories and things like that. Yeah.
It seems that the teams use terrain as well as part of the training, not just your watch, but what terrain you're going to have to run on. We see in the book references to forest running, and I've looked at it on YouTube, people looping in and out of trees in lines and going around in circles and just having fun, but uphill often in a forest and probably at altitude. And then there's a thing called, if I pronounce it correctly, Korakonch, which sounds like it's sort of a crushed gravel or something like that. So dirt roads. And then it's sort of a graduation to asphalt when you're ready to really go hard and fast, and you're matured in your running. It seems almost like they use terrain as a training device.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about condition being something that often people wouldn't say, like, you know, how can I get condition? How can I get fit? They would say, like, where is condition? Where can I find it? And that would be to do with looking at a distribution of different altitudes and surfaces that were going to add up to making them fitter. So they would go to a place called Akaki when they wanted to run really fast, because that was at lower altitude, sort of 2,200 meters above sea level. And it was seen as being much hotter, so it was easier to run fast. And then they would go up to Entoto, which is 3,000 meters above sea level in the forest, to run slowly, but benefit from that lack of oxygen up at that sort of altitude. And then, the forest running was to kind of build agility and to deliberately run a bit slower, because you can't run that fast through the trees when you're weaving in and out. Korakonch is just this wonderfully onomatopoeic word that basically in Amharic there's a few different words I think in Amharic that do this, but Korakonch just describes the noise that your foot makes on the surface when you're running. And they said that was especially good surface because you slip back with every step, so it makes you stronger. You're kind of constantly fighting against the ground as well as the hills and things. People were very of the belief that you had to use the different environments to your advantage if you were going to get better. And they also would avoid the roads as much as possible. So we'd train on the road once a week. Even with the marathon runners, they would not step on the road to run more than once a week, because it was seen as damaging for the muscles, killing people's speed, basically.
And are they running in modern shoes?
Yeah. So the guys with in Malcolm's group some of them were under contract with either Adidas or Nike, and the ones that weren't would buy Adidas and Nike shoes from sport shops in Addis. I'm just going to say a couple of them did manage to run. One of the characters in the book, Abera, he did run his first race abroad in a pair of those kind of jelly sandals, because that's what he found more comfortable. And he ran something like a 61-minute half marathon in those in Morocco.
Yikes.
But given the choice, people tended to wear racing shoes.
The thing that struck me early on in the book, and we were talking about it as we were out training ourselves and saying, well, what's remarkable about the Ethiopians was they seem to have sort of an inherent belief that your 208 marathon or whatever it is that's your holy grail is in fact there. It's available to you. It's not, can I train myself? It's, can I access? It's kind of a different mentality, it seems to me. It's sort of course you can run that. It's just, have you prepared yourself? Are you able to adapt to the conditions that are required, which is an entirely different sort of mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what people would say. Adaptation was the word that people use for training. So the idea was that anyone could adapt to running that sort of pace given the right environment and the right conditions. So given that they were able to focus 100% on their running, so being supported to do that without having to do another job at the same time was seen as important. But then if you had that, then it was a question of picking the right people to train with so that you could learn to adapt to their pace, basically, and then just having enough time and consistent training to be able to do it. But I never really heard anyone talk about talent, apart from people talking sometimes about Kenenisa Bekele being like this kind of especially kind of different person, I suppose, in some ways. But in terms of just everyday ideas about talent that we would have, people did think that most of the athletes were able to become a 208 or 206 marathon runner given the right circumstances. I don't think that's probably physiologically the case, but psychologically it probably helps to believe that if you think that everyone can do it, then it means that you're more willing to give it a try, for sure.
You get kind of the Roger Bannister effect.
Yeah,
if
exactly.
Suddenly the 4 minute mile's broken, everyone believes it's possible, and then people start to achieve.
Yeah, we'll have to see whether that happens with the 2 hour marathon now, but yeah.
Yes, we'll find out.
Yeah, exactly.
So you did also mention that so the Ethiopians, there's sort of rules that we kind of follow, like the 20-minute window after exercise, like you should have a snack within the 20-minute window, taking naps, like having a certain number of hours of sleep, and they don't really seem to follow these rules, not obviously, but do you think that they somehow make up for it in other ways? Or maybe do you think that these sort of like rules don't have as much of an impact on our performance as we think they have?
Well, yeah, they did. I mean, no one was ever hitting that 20-minute window of eating something after training, especially in the mornings when we would walk up to the forest to go running. That was like sometimes a 30-40-minute walk, and then we'd often walk back via the shops and going to have a chat with someone or whatever. And when we drove somewhere in the bus to train, it would sometimes take 2 hours to get back through the traffic. So people were just used to training and then being hungry for a couple of hours and then walking home from wherever the bus dropped them off. And that was just like part of running, really, I suppose. It was seen as just an extension. And yeah, I don't know what to make of that, really. I don't think people thought about it too much, but it probably doesn't do any harm in terms of learning how to process energy and learning how to be able to run the last sort of half an hour of a marathon when you haven't been able to take on enough energy and things like that. So, and then with the sleeping thing, people were just much more laid back about it. So they would try to sleep a little bit during the day, but often we'd just all be in the same room watching TV and someone would just be sleeping in the room with everyone else while people were chatting. It wasn't like everyone was obsessively going off on their own to get their 2 hour nap in or anything like that. And then people were just often up in the night running as well, 3 o'clock in the morning. And so it was less a case of trying to make sure you get 8 hours of sleep in a particular chunk, and more just like the sleep is often more distributed throughout the day. But because they're full-time athletes, they are sleeping a lot because there's not that much else to do, I suppose. But not worrying about it, I don't think, too much.
Speak about the up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Seems to be a sort of training philosophy that you mustn't get too comfortable with yourself. We hear a story in the book of you getting woken up by your training friend. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Is it
Haile? Yeah.
Haile, taking you on a 3 a.m. run followed by a cold shower.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the logic behind that is like, well, part of it is that the hill that he wanted to run on was on the road. So you have to go and do it at night so that you don't get run over. But there was also part of the logic is to do with, a lot of the time, people were trying to conserve energy, as I said, and trying to train in this quite sensible way. But then there was also this belief that you had to occasionally embrace kind of this idea of like dangerousness or adventure in order to make particular leaps in your in fitness. So there was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go and run up and down a hill for an hour was a way of sort of showing your dedication to the sport and doing something a bit extraordinary, I suppose, in your training, which was helpful both kind of physically and psychologically, I think, to people. So, but it was interesting because it was something that I was living in the compound with some runners for 6 months before I realized that was happening, that people were going out and running in the night, and I didn't even know until I kind of got to know people well enough for them to sort of let me in on that as a secret, and I was able to get involved in it.
That's interesting. So did they think that you were like, fit enough after 6 months that they thought, it's time to move on to the next level, or it was they didn't think to invite you the other times?
Maybe it was like a level of trust, or that they thought that maybe I'd got used to the sort of way of doing things enough for them to think that I might want to come. I suppose maybe they just assumed that I wouldn't be interested until then. Not that many people, I guess, who want to get up at 3 a.m. to run up and down a hill.
I guess it's sort of it's a mixture of, you know, challenging your limits and being prepared to push your limits, and also just having crazy fun.
Yeah.
This is
exactly.
so sort of enjoyable.
Yeah, people really did enjoy their running, but they were also, most people did say, this is something I'm doing to try and change my life and to try to make something better for myself by making some money and things. So they were aware that running could become quite boring and could become something that was sort of seen as a job in some ways, because it was a job. And so the way of combating that was to make sure that they were introducing things into the training all the time that meant that it would retain this kind of sense of adventurousness and kind of creativity, I think, more than anything, that they were able to stave off the boredom in that way by doing things like running in the night or running up in the forest in particularly challenging terrain, or where the hyenas were and things like that. So it was kind of about keeping things interesting as much as possible, which is definitely one thing that I hope people will take away from the book, is to try to keep things interesting in their running.
We never mentioned the hyenas. Liz would love to run at night with hyenas.
Yeah.
We run in Canada, and occasionally we've run some night runs where there's the possibility of encountering a bear.
Oh wow, yeah. So you do, yeah.
Not my favorite time.
This terrifies Liz.
Yeah, it really does.
The bears are quite, yeah, that's scary. What people said about the hyenas is that that, you know, you don't really need to worry about them too much, but they're just like people, but you do get the odd crazy one. And it only takes one crazy one to be a bit of a problem, which is, I'm sure, is true of the bears as well.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah, because generally they'll tell you that the bear won't bother you. It's only if you surprise the bear. So like the technique is that you're supposed to make a lot of noise.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're running along shouting in the night.
Yeah, you can shout, or you can like play music from your iPhone or whatever. And I mean, I guess usually.
Tell Michael what we did on the trail. We sang Roxanne by the police. Roxanne.
Over and over and over. Yeah, I guess hyenas are smaller than bears, so like maybe it would, but they tend to be in packs. So I don't know which one I'd like better.
I'd probably take the hyena.
I guess doing running as a job and the possible amounts of money that they could earn at the very pinnacle of performance, what we would probably consider to be very modest sums, they could consider to be life-changing amounts of money. Does that create problems for the people training in Ethiopia, or is it's just their holy grail and that's it? Does it create stress, or?
It does. I mean, it is kind of like it's a huge lottery, I suppose, being an athlete, because it is only a tiny fraction of the people who are trying to make it who make the kind of really life-changing money. And if you watch the finish of Dubai Marathon or something, you've got the winner winning $200,000, and then sometimes it's 10 seconds behind them there's somebody winning nothing. And then in terms of how good they are as a runner, they're very, very close to being the same, but the money is just vastly different. So that did create problems. And that's something that I'm trying to work through with some of my more academic writing at the moment, is like the fact that success is definitely seen as being collectively produced in Ethiopia by the group and by people's relationships with their friends and families and things like that. But then when people do make that kind of really stratospheric kind of money in Ethiopia, if they're winning $500,000 in a year, they would often sort of move away from the area where they'd previously lived, and the relationships with the people that they've been training with before that would often break down as a result of that huge influx of money. So it could create problems, and it's difficult when you dedicate years and years of your life to something and then it doesn't work out. So for the people who had to just move back home to the village and go back to farming, if they've been chasing this dream of making huge amounts of money, it did really separate people out between the very few that made loads of money and the vast majority that didn't. There's
a time when you went to several times you visited Bekoji village, which is quite famous for having produced I think 17,000 people in the village, and it's produced like 6 Olympic medals or something out of there. And they do remark that they don't see some of the superstars, they don't see them coming back, and necessarily paying homage to their old village.
Yeah. So yeah, Coach Santayu, he's the main coach in Bakoji, who's coached all of the champions from there. I think it's something like 30 something world championship medals they've got from just that one town. Some of the runners go back, but a lot of them just don't go back to those areas. But Tirunesh Dibaba and Kenenisa Bekele, I think, chipped in together to buy him a house, build him a house there. So he has been looked after to a certain extent, but I think they do feel like there could be more investment from the top athletes back to plow money back into the sport. But there does seem to be this idea that once you've made it, that's kind of a sign that you've sort of been chosen to be successful, and therefore there's less of an obligation to share the money once you've won.
Kenenisa is definitely viewed as something revered. Kenenisa Bekele, in terms of his ability and his success. His coach seemed to see him as someone special. Apart from the fact that he's a quick runner, he's the only one that seems to on the world stage stands next to Eliud Kipchoge. What was it? How did they describe him? How did they talk about Kenenisa Bekele?
He was kind of viewed as the one person on the male side of the sport, at least, who was seen as different. What I've said previously is, about being this lack of belief in talent really didn't apply to Kenenisa, in the sense that he was seen as being especially special. Something about him that meant that if he decided to win a race, that was just it. That was going to happen. And when he was in shape, and people were really kind of lamenting the fact that he's been unable to string the long periods of training together over the last decade, even really, to be up there with Kipchoge. But people really think that he's the most talented runner. Well, I think he's probably the most talented runner of all time. But yeah, Santayu said that he also just he said he'd met quite a lot of athletes who would say, if he asked them when they were 13 what their ambition was, they would say, I want to win the world championships or something. But he said when he asked Kenenisa said it in a way that was like, he just knew that was going to happen, and he was just incredibly sort of focused and driven. But yeah, I think there is something special about him in terms of just his ability, and people did revere it.
You mentioned also at one point that it's not just, so they have these teams that they can make and they can be part of a team, but that's not how they get to the international races. They have to have like an agent.
Yeah.
And then these agents, like some of them they're not honest. So you told a story where a runner, like sometimes runners will go and they'll win prize money and they won't even see the prize money because the agent will just take off with it. Mm-hmm. So is that sort of part of the problem as well? Because, it seems like almost like you need an agent, and then people like the runners really want to compete internationally, so they'll try very hard to find an agent. It doesn't seem like it's regulated in any way, so they're happy to get any agent. And then what if like their partner that they train with ends up winning money and they get the money, and then the other person ends up winning money and they don't get the money because the agent takes off with it?
It is regulated, so you're supposed to, as an athlete manager, you're supposed to do an exam and be accredited by World Athletics and be accredited by whichever governing body within a country whose athletes you want to work for. So you should have accreditation from World Athletics and from the Ethiopian Athletics Federation if you're working in Ethiopia, or from Kenyan Athletics if you're working in Kenya, for example. So, and most of the top managers who are sending people to like Berlin Marathon or London Marathon have that accreditation, and they're kind of the top level of management. But what you had in Ethiopia was also people who realized that there was this business opportunity of sending people unofficially to races, smaller races, normally in like China or India or Thailand and places like that. And those relationships could be very exploitative. So they would, sometimes fly someone to a race in China, but then they would end up staying for 5 weeks and running 3 different marathons for like not particularly good prize money, and then find that there's just, after the hotel bills and all that kind of stuff, there's no money left at the end of that process, or they'd fly back and then never see the agent again, and the money would disappear. So that's a big problem, and it's still a problem. It's something that I'm trying to sort of do more research about and write about a bit more at the moment. It's often an educational problem as well. Young athletes don't know what to look for in an agent. They don't know what kind of questions to ask to make sure that someone's reputable and that they're not going to be exploited. So that's something that I'm trying to do at the moment, is to kind of work with Ethiopian Athletics to provide more information for young athletes.
So these agents, they're not like with the team. They're sort of, they're agents and they work for Ethiopian Athletics.
So those agents don't work for, so the people who are sending athletes to sort of small races in China and things, sometimes they're not affiliated to anything at all. They're not affiliated to Ethiopian athletics. They're not necessarily particularly connected to the clubs either. They just would approach a young athlete and say, look, are you interested in going to this race in China? And then they just organize it. People like Malcolm and Eliud Kipchoge's management agency or something like that, that's a completely different situation. They're very professional, sign a contract with athletes that it's very clear. And then the deal is basically that pretty much across the board, agents take 15% of all earnings from athletes. That's how it works. In exchange for organizing their races and planning the racing schedule and all that kind of thing.
We hear a lot about the running clubs and your influence and not your influence, how you perceive the guys who are running. Unfortunately, they all seem to be male. There's I assume there's a segregation. Was it inappropriate for you to mix with the ladies and get feedback from the women runners, or?
It was more just that, especially at the beginning of my field work when I didn't know people particularly well, because of the kind of background of most of the runners being quite traditional sort of rural upbringings. Most of the female runners were very, very shy around me, didn't really want to talk to me. It wouldn't have been appropriate for me necessarily to interview them, one-to-one, especially. So I just made a decision fairly early on that I was going to write a PhD thesis and therefore the book about male running. The group there were, roughly 15 to 20 men in the group and about 15 to 20 women as well. Just I ended up, most of the friends that I made and the kind of stronger relationships that I had were with the male athletes. So that's
okay. So
that's
the women were there. The women were there.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just that you were writing and operating in amongst the male group.
Yeah. So in hindsight, actually, in terms of the training and things, it would have been far better for me to train with the women's group. that would have been more my level. It probably would have been better for me as an athlete, I think. And that really came home to me in running Frankfurt Marathon. I ran with the elite women basically the whole marathon. It was brilliant running in that group with them. But yeah, it was a decision I made just because of not wanting to make people feel uncomfortable asking them loads and loads of questions as an anthropologist, I guess.
So did you use your new fitness when you got back to like that marathon that you did in Frankfurt? Was that sort of shortly after you came back to the UK, or?
It was a while after I got back, but I used I kind of trained for it through sort of partially through being coached by my old coach back in Durham actually, and then partially through adapting some of the stuff that I was doing in Ethiopia. Immediately after I got back from Ethiopia, actually, I wasn't running that well myself, just because I think, as I said before, in trying to keep up with people so much in order to write the book and in order to write the PhD thesis, I was kind of overtraining the whole time at altitude as well, and just not really allowing myself to recover as well as I should have been. So a lot of the time when the athletes were kind of resting and sleeping between training sessions, that's when I was like typing notes and writing and stuff. So and going to Amharic lessons and things like that. So I was just I think I was overtrained and a bit tired most of the time when I got back. But I definitely I've incorporated stuff since that I learned, I think.
And I think you had a goal of going sub 220. So did that ever happen?
Not yet. I was hoping that I might run a marathon in 2020 to have a go at that, but it's not happened, unfortunately, as a result of all this stuff. I think I was in shape to do it in London Marathon in 2019, but I got tonsillitis about a week before the race. Dropped out at 15 miles. It's I don't know, it's tantalizingly close. I've run 2:20:53, so I feel like it's a second per kilometer, just over a second per kilometer. So I would like to give it one last crack, but we'll see what the pandemic throws at us over the next year or so.
So it's definitely there in front of you. You just have to adapt, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
As the Ethiopians would say.
I hope the rest of the world adapts to allow it to happen as well.
Something that we've seen, and it's not in your book, but something that we've seen with poorer countries is there's, because of the money involved, there's a big temptation in terms of drug-assisted performances. You don't touch on this at all in your book, but is the specter of doping, we've seen problems in Kenya. Is it similar in Ethiopia?
I think, yeah, it definitely happens. I didn't see it, firsthand. No one talked about it sort of directly to me, particularly, which is why I didn't really write about it in the book. But yeah, there was the Guardian sort of investigative piece about Addis, where they went into the pharmacy opposite the stadium and were sold EPO over the counter and things like that. So it's available. My feeling is that it's much too expensive for the vast majority of athletes to engage in doping. So if it is happening, it's only at the very top level with a small proportion of people. Sometimes people talked about it, but there was a sense that people were never quite sure what was a vitamin and what was prohibited, and it was sort of, there wasn't that much information for people to go on about performance enhancing drugs, which made me feel like it probably wasn't something that was happening all the time. But then, as you suggest, the increasing pressure, the increased competition, and the sort of temptation to do it in order to sort of benefit economically is definitely there. So it could well have been happening. It's hard to tell. Well, one of the interesting things was that the people talked more about witchcraft and about the dangers of people doing that than they did about doping. And when they did talk about doping, they talked about it in a similar way to forms of witchcraft, which were seen as similarly kind of illicit ways of benefiting and cheating other people.
Stealing energy from people was one of the
energy, or they say, that's a way of taking a shortcut. So it's like that, which is cheating and not doing something in a way that's fair, and as a result of kind of hard work, basically.
They seem to have a strong belief that you need to live a good life in order to achieve the objectives. So there's something sort of rather wholesome about that.
Yeah, so that's connected to like an Amhara or Ethiopian idea about chance, or what they call idil, which basically is this belief that when all is said and done, it'll really be God that decides what happens to you and how your life unfolds, and it'll be God who decides who wins and who loses. So basically, the kinds of behavior that were seen as being rewarded by God were kind of patience, consistency, humility, and things like that, which just happen to be the kinds of characteristics that make a good runner a lot of the time. So being a good Orthodox Christian in Ethiopia lent itself to being a good athlete, because it was the kind of disposition that they would adopt was useful for taking that kind of long-term approach to their running and living this kind of quite secluded, quite sort of virtuous sort of lifestyle. Yeah.
Oh, along the same lines, based on your experience in Ethiopia, do you have any training tips for all of us?
Yeah, I think just try to find ways of keeping running as interesting as possible, I think, is the main one. As much variety as possible, maybe adopting some of the kind of zigzag running techniques and things like that I describe in the book, finding particular environments that are a bit more challenging, and kind of deliberately seeking out unusual places rather than just sticking to the same routines all the time. I think that would be the main one.
What that tells you, Liz, is that you need to get off the streets and into the trails.
Oh,
yeah, exactly.
No.
Exactly.
And if there are hyenas, then you should bring your friend.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that getting on the trails thing is definitely, we kind of have this separation between road running and trail running, I think, a lot of the time. And actually, you look at how the best road runners in the world train, it's 90% of it is off road and only a small proportion of it is on the road. So that's kind of an interesting thing, I think.
Do you think if money comes into the trail running sport, which increasingly ultra trails are becoming trendy, and having money flowing in from all sorts of places, mostly corporations, do you think Ethiopians could make good trail runners?
Yeah, well, they definitely could. It would be a case of motivating them to do it, though. That's the thing, because at the moment, I mentioned it to a few people, because I actually ran the World 50K Championships while I was in Ethiopia. I went and ran that in Doha. And when people asked me what I was training for, and I said that, they said, no, there's nothing. It's 42K is the furthest race. So, because with the history of running in Ethiopia and the way that it kind of took off as a culture, being so connected to Haile Gebreselassie winning the Olympic marathon in Rome, the marathon is kind of still the big deal in Ethiopia, is the marathon. So there's not that much interest in the stuff beyond the marathon. Although, yeah, if the prize money was there, people would train for that stuff, I think. At the moment, I don't think there are any managers working with Ethiopian runners to send them to those kinds of races. It might be interesting to do it, for someone to do it.
We were chatting with Darren and Finn about Rise of the Ultra Runners a few months ago, and he told us about his attempts to get Kenyans to come and run some ultras, which were abysmal failures, basically.
Yeah, but I don't understand. Few runners have come across to run races with Hadran, but I think if you're going to do it, you've got to get a good marathon runner, and then train them for trail running. Not you might as well go with a good athlete rather than just bringing someone random, I suppose. But I think we'll see what happens. There's been quite a few Ugandans run really well in mountain running championships, so it's definitely starting to take off.
Do you think you'll go back to Ethiopia and train there?
Been back quite a few times since the period of time that's covered in the book, but then not for the last year, obviously, with the pandemic. I was there in February. But yeah, I'd love to go back if there's interest from people who've read the book in going over, then it might be a case of trying to organize like a training trip for people or something like that at some point in the future. But I'll be going backwards and forwards for research purposes anyway over the next few years, hopefully. I like to try and get back once or twice a year if I can, because it's, apart from anything else, it's just a fantastic place and got a lot of friends there and things.
Fantastic. Did you feel unsafe at any stage while you were over there? Because there's stories Eritrea and conflict. I'm not sure of the politics, but we hear stories. Was there any evidence of that? Did you feel unsafe?
I never personally felt unsafe, not in the way that I would feel sort of walking around Nairobi at night, for example. You can, in the part of Addis where I lived, I could walk in the pitch black from a cafe up to where I lived on my iPhone and not worry that someone was going to mug me, even at night. So I felt like it was very safe. Politically, I mean, there was a crackdown when I was in Ethiopia on political dissidents, and that involved them basically switching the internet off for several weeks, which is pretty inconvenient in terms of talking to Roslyn, my partner, and things like that. But I never felt personally unsafe. I don't know what the situation. I've not been back obviously this year, and most of the conflict is obviously up towards Tigray region at the moment. I imagine it's a lot more tense at the moment, but hopefully, just have to hope that things settle down relatively soon.
I mean, this book is only coming out in January, right?
I think it comes out on the 12th, I think.
Okay, and do you have anything else in the pipeline? Any other projects, another book that you're working on, or?
Not another book yet. I actually do want to do a project on ideas around anti-doping next, sort of more broadly, not just in Ethiopia, but looking at kind of doping in cross-cultural perspective. So rather than just assuming that everyone has the same attitude towards doping, try to look at different countries and how people think about kind of doping, but also just sporting morality more generally. So that's kind of the next academic project, and whether that makes its way into a book for a popular audience as well, I'm not sure, but we'll see.
One of the people we spoke to recently in our series was Matt Hart, who wrote the book Win at All Costs.
Yeah.
And he'd spent 3 years. Well, you've got a copy behind you.
Yeah.
Well done. Matt will be very happy.
Yeah.
And he spent 3 years basically researching a lot of stuff that isn't in his book, background around doping and doping culture.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading that. But I just think it's really interesting, and especially looking at it from kind of perspective of Ethiopia and Kenya. Reading something like Matt's book, it really makes it clear how this is like an equality issue as well. I think in terms of, we think about sporting fairness just in terms of which chemicals are entering somebody's body. I think that's quite a limited way of thinking about what fairness looks like in terms of kind of access to opportunities and access to that kind of information, because this is, in Nike running in the States, that's very much dependent upon this huge amount of money and technology and kind of expertise that goes into allowing people to tread that very fine line between what's legal and what's not, and that's not available to people in Ethiopia and Kenya, obviously, that kind of approach. So
getting access to something that's borderline but legal much earlier than somebody else could. So
the issues of kind of morality and fairness, I think, are really interesting.
Just before we wrap up we'll give our summary thoughts on the book. What was some of the most interesting or fun things that you experienced while you were in it? The remarkable things
to do with running, or more generally?
Either.
Running wise, I mean, just general. Getting up at 4:30 in the morning in the dark, getting on a bus, and then the sun sort of rising as we arrived in somewhere like Sandafa, and then just like the running is just so stunning. It's just amazing. So like those rolling roads that I described, you're just descending sort of 200 meters and then ascending at 200 meters, and it's just farmland as far as you can see on either side. It's just a stunningly beautiful place and always amazing. It's always sunny. It's always basically 22 degrees all the time in Ethiopia. So it's just like wonderful from that point of view. What were some of the interesting things? I learned how to kill a sheep and butcher a sheep as part of sort of celebrating someone's wedding. That was quite interesting, unusual thing.
So in terms of the gorgeous running, if you do organize tours, we need to stay tuned to get on,
Yeah.
to get in on that if we can afford it and the travel opens up again. How are people going to find you, Michael? Do you have a website?
Not yet, actually. No, just on Twitter at MPH Crawley.
Okay, so everybody should link to you so they can find out when you organize the tour. And
it depends on things settling down.
Okay, let's do a little summary. I'll just ask Liz for her thoughts on the book.
So obviously, I thought the story was fascinating, and it reinforced how important our belief systems are to our performance. It made me want to see if I could follow the feet of the runner in front of me during workouts. So that would be mostly Alan's feet in this case, because we don't really have group workouts, and even if we did, his feet are the closest. So I found it refreshing and informative to see a different perspective on training and the benefit of not training alone. I think it's so different to sort of like how we are here in North America, and how, most runners sort of, they tend to want to mostly run alone until they're good enough to run with a team, and they sort of don't see themselves as good enough to run with a team. And it seemed like the culture is completely different in Ethiopia. It's sort of like, well, no, you come and you run with a team or with people in order to become a better runner and to change as a runner and as a person. So I really liked that sort of aspect of the story. The story was well written, and you get to feel like you know the people yourself, like you got to know them. And the book did a good job of telling us both the story of why Ethiopian runners are so dominant and the difficulties they face trying to get into a team where they can earn a living wage. I like that it was not just a romanticized version of runners from a poor background without shoes that ended up being stars, which is a little bit sort of those stories we usually hear. I would recommend it to anyone curious about what makes the East Africans the best runners in the world. Also to anybody that wants a few tips for their own running.
For my part, I think the book puts you into the country of Ethiopia, so you feel that you're walking in your shoes, Michael, in terms of the experience. And it shows you also how running fits in a special way into the culture of Ethiopia. So your skill as an anthropologist shows through in the storytelling. The book also puts you into the character and behavior of some of the runners, which is also a reflection of what they believe in and what their culture is. We touched on that during our discussions a little bit. Something we didn't mention, but the color photographs are great. The version that we were provided had all the color photographs with it, and it gives you an actual visual insight. And that prompted me to then go on YouTube and look for Bekoji village and see what it was really like.
You should, if you've not seen it, there's a great film, Town of Runners, set in Bekoji.
Ooh.
Really, really good documentary.
Great, thanks for the advice. It's excellent. We'll be looking that one up before the holidays are over. Yeah, it was a shame there wasn't more info for me on female runners, but you've explained why that is, how it is. And of course that leaves you an opportunity for next time, maybe.
Well, actually, I was going to say there's an anthropologist, Hannah Borenstein, who's writing a PhD at the moment at Duke University on female running in Ethiopia. So she will hopefully have a book out at some point. I'm not sure when, but she's great. So there will be a book about it. It just won't be by me.
Sounds great. I'd read that.
The thing I love particularly, because it touches my own character, is the sort of craziness of the team environment, the camaraderie, doing crazy stuff, and recognizing each other because of being dangerous or daring to do something or taking the lead and running hard. Liz is smiling because I just finished the book and we had a hill session last week, and we were supposed to do 10 sprints controlled up the hills, and we were with a couple of people who run faster than I do. And what I did on the first sprint is I just went absolutely flat out and got to the first hill first, but I was completely exhausted. So then I took the second hill and I just went flat out again, and I got to the top of the hill first again. But of course, then I was smashed and I got absolutely crushed on the following hills. but it then became a story and we're all laughing about it and saying how stupid we were. And so you lose some training benefit, but you get some sort of team benefit.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Totally.
clear. That's what the Ethiopians do a little bit.
Yeah, definitely, especially in the speed training and stuff. Yeah.
You know, you gave us that insight. We can see our own experiences in some of those things. So it's a fantastic read from that point of view. So if you haven't got your pre-order in, get your copy. Our discussions don't do the book justice in any way. And of course, you need to find out how Michael gets on in his race.
Well, thank you both for the close reading of the book. I really appreciate that.
Do you also have a place where you would like people to get the book?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I think it's definitely available from Amazon, and I'd buy it from an independent bookshop if it's available, but I'm not sure exactly where it will be.
That's fair. I know it's on Amazon because I went to check and it's available for pre-orders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And thank you, because you're currently in the UK and we're conducting this in the evening on the east coast of North America. Thank you for staying up late to speak with us.
You're welcome. I hope I didn't sound tired.
Not at all.
So thank you for listening to another episode of Running Book Reviews. A big thank you to the publisher, Bloomsbury, for providing a review copy and also putting us in touch with Michael. And a big thanks to Michael Crawley again for spending time with us today and for being up so late. If you'd like to leave us feedback about how we can improve the podcast or want to suggest a book that you'd like us to read in the future, you can leave us a comment on social media. We're Running Book Reviews on Facebook and Instagram, and on Twitter, we are reviews_running. You can follow us on social media. You'll see when the new episodes are released. Or you can just subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast streaming platform.
And that's all from Running Book Reviews.